Hello and welcome back to another update where I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. This is the second update on the Kharkiv region where we see that the Russians have started their new offensive. It is becoming clearer and clearer what exactly is happening. Based on the latest reports, the Russians are attacking and contesting 10 separate villages while having captured 4. The main push of the Russians is happening north of Kharkiv city directly, and a secondary push is happening to the northeast by the Seversky Donetsk River. Directly north of the city of Kharkiv, the Russians have entered from multiple directions. Directly to the north of the city towards the villages of Kodivka and Hoptivka, here by the main highway, the Russians have entered into the Ukrainian border and have managed to attack both of these villages, contesting both of them. At the same time, the Russians have entered into the northeastern parts from multiple directions, both from the northwest through Strilecha, which they have captured, and now fighting has reached Hlyboke. To the north, the Russians have entered through Pilnya, here in the northeastern parts of the area, after which they have expanded in the direction of Olynykove and Modokovets, here to the southwest of that position, and they have attacked both from Strilecha and the Pilnya area to capture Krasne, which has several fortifications near it. So the Russians have managed to capture the villages of Strilecha, Krasne, Pilna, and Borisivka, and fighting has reached Hlyboke, Modokovets, Olynykove, Lukyantsy, and Selene, where all of these villages are contested. With the main push coming from the northeast of the Kharkiv city, we see that the Russian main objective is, according to the Ukrainian command, the Russians are planning to create this 10 to 15 kilometer quote-unquote sanitary zone where the Russians are looking to release the shelling of Belgorod. Ever since the Russians started this Kharkiv offensive, the Ukrainians have significantly increased the shelling of Belgorod city and the region itself to hit the Russian reserve and simply retaliate for this Russian offensive. Further east, the Russians have also entered from separate directions. They have entered directly north from the Russian parts of the border towards Platinivka, where fighting has started in the village and it is contested. At the same time, they've also entered from the northwest, from the borderline there, where they are fighting by Ohirseve and Hatishe. Both of these villages are also contested west of Vovchansk, where there is the Severodonetsk River in between them. The Russians are looking to gain control over the northern bank of it before moving on to Vovchansk. At the same time, the Russians have also attacked the eastern flank of Vovchansk by fighting in the direction of the village of Sibine, where that village is also contested as well. It's reported that the Russians are heavily bombarding any concentration of Ukrainian troops being gathered in this section of the front line. This is a very interesting development because we're seeing that the Russian force that is entering is not really a specifically significant amount of troops. It is unclear exactly how many have entered so far, but based on the footage and the Russian advances, the areas in which the fighting is taking place, it is not a significant number. I would be surprised if it's more than 2,000. Based on these operations and the fact that the Russian Air Force and artillery is heavily working to support the Russian army, the Ukrainians are responding quickly because they see this as the beginning of something much larger, a large-scale Russian offensive in the direction of Kharkiv city. Mainstream media has quoted the White House to have said that the Russians are launching a massive offensive in the direction of Kharkiv. At least that is what the Ukrainians and the White House is expecting, that this is the initial stages of such an attack. The Russians do not currently have the necessary amount of troops for such an attack near the border, but this is changing by the day where the Russians are sending more and more troops to this northern border. The interesting part is that it is also reported that a significant amount of troops is being concentrated near the Sumy border. This means one of two things, that the Russians will either expand their offensive operations in the northern direction, where some reports even go as far as to say that they are being concentrated in the direction of the Chernihiv region as well, in the Bryansk direction, Based on these reports, it is one of two things. The Russians are going to expanding their offensive operations in a northern direction, or that the Russians are going to be doing some of these small incursions across the border where they will gain control over some border villages and try to hold on to them. The Russian offensive so far is going to be a small offensive push, after which they will switch to a defensive nature. This is to force the Ukrainians to send reinforcements to the area, which they have already started doing. By sending reinforcements quickly, they have to concentrate them in large bulks, and especially if they want to counterattack, that is what is needed. The Russians are in turn heavily bombarding any of such concentrations with their FAB 500, FAB 1500 bombs, as well as massive MLRS and artillery strikes on those Ukrainian positions. It is reported that one of the largest concentrations was by Vovchansk, after which the Russians heavily bombarded it and has been bombarding it non-stop since the start of these operations. It's reported that the Russians have continuously shelled, launched MLRS strikes and FAB bombs on Vovchansk since the very first minute of this operation and until this point. It is becoming clear that in the northeastern direction, the Russians are looking to gain control over this area right here, connecting all the way up to Vovchansk and then down to the Russian border. This will create a small bulge, after which they will look to gain control over the area here to the northeast of Kharkiv city itself, and they'll likely look to gain control over Vesely as well, here connecting this road to the major forest patches here to the west of the Russian positions by Vovchansk, and possibly explain it to connect all of this into one large bulge, and then they'll be moving in western and eastern directions to expand it along the borderline. The idea of the Russians mainly fighting by the border area has significant advantages to the Russian army compared to going deeper into Kharkiv. The closer the Russians get to Kharkiv city center, the more difficult the fighting is going to become for them. So the longer they stay by the border area, the more advantages they will have, in the sense of proximity of any firepower they have available by Belgorod. They'll be able to have the range necessary to help the Russian soldiers anywhere near the border area. At the same time, the Russians would be able to enter from anywhere they want to support the Russian soldiers currently active within the Ukrainian side of the border area. The Russians could enter from any area within their side of the border and then attack the Ukrainian positions there to support those Russian soldiers. The Russians would have the entire initiative, as the Ukrainians would not be able to know where they would be attacking from next. Of course, there are modern technologies that allow them to see where the concentration of troops are, but if the concentration of troops are everywhere in the Kharkiv region, then which of them will actually enter is a different question. So we're seeing that there is the initiative on the Russian side in this case, but as soon as Russians enter the city of Kharkiv, then the Ukrainians would regain the initiative, because that is the law of urban war. This is why we're seeing that the Russians are unlikely to launch any sort of operation into Kharkiv city itself until they have a larger concentration of troops in the area that gains them a significant enough advantage that will allow them to actually fight towards the city and gain control of it in a larger operation, which the White House is expecting the Russians to plan. So we're seeing that the fighting is taking place here to the north of the Kharkiv city in the Kharkiv region. There's been this one advance by the Russians here in the village of Nitailove, but they've managed to advance southwards and occupy parts of the villages here to the south. There are some forest lines and patches here to the south, which the Russians are taking control of if they want to secure their positions here by Nitailove, but this is a flanking maneuver towards the Ukrainian fortifications here in the southwestern parts of Nitailove. So we see that the Russians are flanking the Ukrainian fortifications in the area, possibly in a pincer maneuver to gain control of it both from the east and from the west. Heavy fighting is taking place in the rest of the front line, where the Russians are intensifying their offensive operations. According to the Ukrainian General Staff, Ukrainian Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces Syrsky said that the Russians have intensified their offensive operations everywhere across the entire point of contact, meaning everywhere from the Zaporizhia front and all the way up to Kupiansk. These developments are putting immense pressure on the Ukrainian forces. The fact that they have to relocate to the north to defend against the Russian attack in that direction. The Ukrainians are weakening their positions here in the south and east. This means if the Russians continue to expand in a northern direction and continue to hold on to their positions, or even continue pressuring the Ukrainian positions to advance further, the more the Ukrainians are forced to withdraw from the front to send in reserve towards the Kharkiv and Sumy regions, which would make it extremely difficult for the Ukrainians to hold on to their positions, which are already crumbling due to the Russian offensive in that direction. The Ukrainians say they expect the main push of the Russians to be here west of Avdiivka towards Pokrovsk, north of Avdiivka towards Konstantinivka, west of Bakhmut towards Chasiv Yar, and in the direction of Kupiansk in the north. They expect that the Russians will look to gain control over all of these villages and cities to push and gain a massive advantage in the Donetsk region and eventually gain full control of it. If the Russians gain full control over the Donetsk region, including the eastern bank of the Uskar River line, they would not need such a massive concentration of troops in that direction, and they would be able to relocate the majority of them to other sections of the front line to strengthen those positions. The Ukrainians are currently building a lot of fortifications by the Kharkiv and Sumy regions. This may be why the Russians are launching their offensive operations ahead of concentrating enough troops. This is to slow down the Ukrainian building of fortifications and put a stop to it before they finish it, unlike the Ukrainian operation, which completely waited until the Russians had completely finished the Surovikin line, and that put a complete end to their offensive operations before it even began. And that is going to be all for this update. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, check out our Patreon for additional content. Thank you all for watching and have a great day.